Hello, folks. Welcome back. Welcome back. Um, Today we are rounding off our series, our mini series on colonialism in Africa with this speculative, ambitious effort called a balance sheet of colonialism. So before we get into that, let me just mention a couple things. The first thing is this particular series to which this episode belongs, is the Intro to African History series. So take it as that. The nuances of it are, if you're doing like an entry level college course to Africa, these are some of the conversations that we'll have, and hopefully that pique your interest and you can go further into the reading yourself beyond that. And so that's that. And last week I had my first video on this channel that was not a part of that series, that was focusing on the land reform in Zimbabwe. So there'll be videos like that as well that are more nuanced, that may be of very specific particular interest. So make sure you go and check that out too if that's something you'd be interested in. But without further ado, let me share my screen and we'll get to talking about the balance sheet of colonialism, what that even is, and why this conversation is even worth having. Okay, cool. All right, give me a moment. And just like that, we are cooking with gas. All right, cool. All right, perfect. So what do I mean? What do you mean when you say the balance sheet of colonialism? Well, the idea is some scholars, mainly apologists of colonialism, and some folks who are given to this idea of, who claim to be objective and so forth, and even some other pretty rational people have sought to cast colonialism, as we've been talking about it, in a more positive light. In fact, a couple years ago, was it 2018, an article by Bruce Gilley came out that says that made the case for colonialism and even questioned whether Africa should be recolonized or not. With him leaning on the side that it should be recolonized. So there's this sort of conversation around the legacy of colonialism. Was it as bad as we think it is, as people say it was, or maybe it was pretty good? So if you study economics, or if you just do this sort of financial decisions, you'll be familiar with the idea of a balance sheet. And essentially, a balance sheet is just a pros and cons list, through which at the end of it you can evaluate whether this is worth it, or we should throw this out. So that's what we are doing today. And this forces me as a scholar, and but more importantly as an African, and a pro African, pro black person, to really confront some, as an anti-colonial person, let me put it that way as well, to really confront my own biases, okay, and try to be as objective as possible. But obviously, my voice will show in all this. So, without further ado, let's get started. What does this balance sheet of colonialism even look like? Okay, so these are some of the main things that people talk about when they talk about the pros, and I'll run through them quickly. Then we'll go into each one of them specifically. First of all, there's an argument that colonialism brought about enduring peace on the continent. The resulting independent African states that came after, that introduced the continent to different judicial and bureaucratic systems. That African nationalism was a byproduct of colonialism. That it established professional standing armies in the different countries. That it led to infrastructure and urbanization growth in Africa for the 20th century. the spread of religion, particularly Christianity in this sense, and the growth of the primary sector. That's things like mining and farming and other raw materials extraction, if you will. So those are the pros, right? The cons I'll talk about a little bit later. But let's go into the pros as they are argued one by one. Okay. So the first argument that has been made is that colonialism, after the scramble for Africa, right, at the Berlin Conference, at the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885, and the aftermath of that, that colonialism eventually, under the colonial control of Western European nations, Africa endured, as a whole, endured a period of enduring peace, with the high point of that peace being between the end of the First World War right up until after the Second World War. So that sort of 2 to 3 decade period was an era of enduring peace, which was and this is the argument that is made, by the way, this is in the aftermath of years of, centuries even of quote unquote tribal conflict, and some of which had facilitated the transatlantic slave trade and these other sort of things. After all, the one of the dictates of the Berlin Conference was to end intra-African enslavement, right? So since that institution largely ended, the argument has been made that it brought about enduring peace. That's one. Secondly, the idea is that colonialism brought about the creation of independent states on the continent. And when you look at this picture here, or this side-by-side picture, you see that in 1914, right? That's the 20 or so years after the Berlin Conference. This is what the map of Africa looked like. Okay, and what you'll see is this is what the map of Africa looks like today. And one thing you'll notice right away is they look very similar as far as borders goes. So it's as if, and this is today, of course, Africa is independent. At least politically, so colonialism is over. So when you look at this map and you look at them side by side, 100 years apart, they look identical, which leads to the notion that, because there's a few breaks here, for example, with British East Africa splitting up to account for Kenya and Tanzania. German East Africa was Tanzania. But in any case, one of the major differences is the split of the Sudan into Sudan and South Sudan. So there's a few more countries now than there was back then. But for the most part, the map and the borders look very similar, right? So that's another thing that, the only reason we have this independent African states as they exist right now is because of the colonial era. That's another argument made. Another one is that colonialism brought about judicial and bureaucratic systems to the continent, right? That is to say that when you look at parliament right now, the different parliaments that the different African countries have, when you look at the law systems that are used today, a lot of them is based on Roman law. So these ideas that Africa is better off because this introduced the system of even colonial administration, which introduced things like IDs and passports and these things. So the argument is that the continent benefits because of that, of these legacies that were brought about by the European settlers. Another argument that is made is the advent of African nationalism. And I think it is important here to emphasize what African nationalism is, because we know what nationalism is in a broader sense. But when we talk about African nationalism, historically, we are talking about the spirit of nationalism that rose among Africans, that was driven by the oppression that came from colonialism. That is to say, the idea of African nationalism and fighting back really grew out of the need to fight back against colonialism, right? So and when we talk about African nationalism, we're talking about African nationalism as well as the sense of Pan-Africanism, the idea of people of Africa, people of the continent of Africa and African descent, even in the diaspora, need to come together in order to push back against these forces of imperialism. So some people claim that without colonialism, that would not exist. And I'll talk about how silly that sounds if you haven't picked up on it already. Another legacy is this idea of professional standing armies, right? Prior to colonialism, the standing armies were rare on the continent. Samori Toure in modern day Guinea at the time had standing armies. Some of the kings of Dahomey had standing armies, as well as Shaka Zulu in the early 19th century had standing armies as well. However, for the most part, there were no standing armies or professional armies, right? What that just means is when a war had to be fought, men from the community, either from the town, if it was a town, or from the village, if it was a village, or from the kingdom, if it was a kingdom, would be brought in and immediately strapped up, and they would go to fight. They were not professional soldiers for the most part. So that's another argument that because of colonialism, we now have these African countries now have the standing armies, the standing professional armies. Another argument, one that is given a lot of weight, is the idea of infrastructure and urbanization, that much of the development that we see, with things like development of roads, building of roads, railroads, harbors, telephone systems, sewer systems, all these things are a product in large part, in many parts of the continent, let me say that, of colonial administrations, right? That brought about some of these things to the country, mainly to the African interior. In North Africa, some of these things were already in place, and as well as in other parts. But to the interior of Africa, mainly, these were things that were brought about by the Westerners by way of colonialism. Okay. The other argument that people also give as a pro is the spread of religion, primarily Christianity. And as we've seen in this series, there was colonialism there was Christianity already in Egypt, going back as far back as the 1st century AD, right? The first bishopric led by the Apostle Mark was founded in Alexandria in Egypt. You can talk about the Coptics in Egypt as well. You can talk about some of the Sudanese, Nubian Coptics, as well as the Christians of Ethiopia. So there were those communities up there. But for the rest of the continent, it has to be considered that Christianity came by way of colonialism. Okay. Then another argument that is given is this idea of the growth of the primary sector. It is during the colonial era that we see a boom in this primary sector. We see the mining potential of the continent realized, particularly with scientific methods, including prominently the diamonds of South Africa, the copper belt of Zambia, these sort of things. We also see prominent rubber harvesting in Zaire, with the Congo Free State at the time, under the rulership of King Leopold. And these other places. So we see this extraction of resources. We even see, even in places like Rhodesia, just a boom in agriculture. For example, Rhodesia in 1959, I believe, 1959 or 1960, became only the second nation in the world after the USA to introduce this hybrid maize for planting, which really made them, which made the produce, it exponentially grew the production of maize in the country. So you see some of these things that are talked about as being pros, right? Because they introduced these things to the continent. However, so I'll let you think about that a little bit, and you can evaluate the pros of that, and maybe you can go do further reading, and I'll put some sources in the description. to see the merits of this. However, some of these, to me, are pretty silly, and other scholars have also debunked them, right? So I'll try do a quick evaluation of these across the board. So enduring peace, I think, is one of the more whimsical, ridiculous claims. So while we can concede that there was intra-African fighting prior to colonialism, as I explained earlier, much of which facilitated or assisted in the enslavement, in the transatlantic slave trade and so forth. That not only is that not unique to Africa, okay, in that throughout the 15th, 16th, 17th century, European conflict was rife as well, and even going back further. But that's not a justification. A large part of what was happening immediately before the scramble for Africa was the continent, by and large, was entering a period of post-slavery peace. Since the end of the transatlantic slave trade, right? The slave trade, and communities were no longer reliant on capturing different communities to sell them off into enslavement. And actually, there was a growing natural resource trade on the continent, which, if you know about trading in natural resources, you're better off being at peace with the people you're trading with, as opposed to when you have to capture them. So I say this to say the scramble for Africa happens to descent upon a continent that is already moving towards peace. That's the first thing. The second thing is this: you cannot claim that it brought about enduring peace when itself, the moment of colonization, was very, very brutal. Very, very brutal. We've spoken about in more recent episodes, particularly the one where we spoke about the Congo Free State, about the brutality of King Leopold, who's said to have been responsible for the death of 10 million Africans, right? In those couple of decades that he ruled over what was the Congo Free State, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? You can talk about the Germans clapping back, quote unquote, against the Herero people of Namibia then, and killing 80% of them. 80% of the Herero people were slaughtered in one go in the early 1900s, 1905, I believe. So when you talk about enduring peace, and that's just an example of two places, we can talk about several other places in which thousands and thousands of people were killed as a way to subdue them, right? Even after that subjugation, so the period that they claim to have been peaceful was between the First and the Second World War. Well, first of all, that's a very short time for you to be claiming that this was peaceful. Secondly, Africans by the thousands were sent off to fight in those wars, or at least play a role in those wars, and thousands, tens of thousands of them died as a result of it. So even if you claim that their homelands were peaceful, they were having to fight on behalf of these empires, right? So Kenyans and Rhodesians fighting on behalf of the British Empire, and those from West Africa fighting on behalf of the French Empire. So there was no peace in their communities when people are being shipped off to sea. I mean, shipped off to fight in the trenches or fight against Hitler. And also there were some prominent battles that were fought on the continent itself, right? So even during those times, when you look at fighting against the Germans in German East Africa, those wars actually happened and involved a lot of African people as well. So it's whimsical. You're looking at, maybe if you eliminate all that, you're looking at maybe like 10 or 15 years of enduring peace, because bear in mind that immediately after the Second World War, the era of African nationalism begins. Soon you'll see the rise of the Mau Mau in Kenya. You'll see the Zimbabwean War of Independence happen, the Second Chimurenga. You'll see the Algerian War. So where is this enduring peace that they're talking about? Oh, And I forgot to mention too that even when it was peaceful, it was done for the purpose of extracting. It wasn't built on this on the principles of Ubuntu and this kumbaya moment. It was so that it is better to extract resources from these spaces when the people are quiet, right? And also, it was a suppressed peace. And the analogy I always give my students is, imagine if there's a conflict within this class, right? And people are getting to each other's throats. And I come in heavy-handed and I say there's no fighting. Well, sure, maybe for the 30 minutes that we have class, there may be peace, but it is bound to erupt the moment I step out, because it was never resolved. It was not enduring in that sense. So when you look at things such as the Biafran War, the Nigerian Civil War, that is a direct product of this quote unquote peace, right? Because these groups were brought together under the 1914 amalgamation of Nigeria, but they remained inimical, but they could not, they kept it under wraps due to the might of the British government. Then once they left, within 7 years of the British leaving, civil war breaks out, and the numbers are pretty stark. I believe it's between 500,000 on the more conservative estimate, but many people say as high as 3 million people died in that war. You can look at the Rwandan genocide, which was facilitated in large part by Belgian colonial engineering of social class and creating ethnicities where none had existed before. So when you look at Africa, if anything, Africa is only entering a relative period of peace in the 21st century, years after the end of colonialism, right? So now, there's conflicts in several places, but for all the things that Africa is going through, it's far more peaceful now than it was, say, in the 90s. So when you look at the immediate legacies of colonialism, there were civil wars everywhere. There was a civil war in Angola. There was a civil war in, there was the Rwandan genocide, civil wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone, the Congolese war, which reigned crazy, the Nigerian civil war we just spoke about. Okay, even in Zimbabwe, there was the Gukurahundi massacres of the Ndebele people. Now, I'm not saying all these things, even though 90% of them can be connected in some way to the colonial system. This is not to remove any agency or blame from the African people participating in these things too. But I think it just debunks this idea of enduring peace as a result of colonialism. If anything, the era of the post-colony is what is leading us into a period of enduring peace, or what looks like enduring peace now across the continent. Okay. The other argument is that of independent African states. It's at best it's neither here nor there. But actually, when you think about it, I think that the independent African states have been a problem. And when I talk about the independent African states, I'm talking about the maintaining of the borders established under European rule. Because what those borders do, in large part, were broken up to satisfy European purpose, to satisfy the colonizers, right? They had no concern for who the people of the land were, who the different groups were. That wasn't their concern. How can we best break this up in a way that appears fair to the signatories of the Berlin Conference, and where we can best maximize these resources, extracting these resources for our own growth. So you see things like countries where people are split across borders, the same people. You look at South Africa and Zimbabwe today, where the Venda people are significant bits of each population is on either side of the border. And I've been to visit the abode of the king of Venda, who's on the South African side. That's the king, that's their king, right? That's the king of their traditional society. But there's people in Zimbabwe who now have to get a passport and so forth to go visit their kin on the other side. This is based on this border, but that seems mundane. You can tell the same thing with the Fulani people of West Africa. But those are some of the more mundane things, right? But when you look at, again, to bring up the Nigerian civil war, which has been my obsession, albeit in a in a casual way lately, as I've been reading and watching about it, that for a long time Nigeria was governed as southern Nigeria and northern Nigeria, those two territories, and in 1914 they were amalgamated, right? And the scholars have argued that it was done so that the more autocratic north would be put in charge of the bigger and more resource-rich south, which include Igbo land and where a lot of the Yoruba people stay. That would allow the British, as part of the indirect rule model, to extract more resources from the resource-rich south by way of putting the northerners as the middlemen. So immediately after that, those conflicts erupt, and again, this is what leads to a large part what leads to the Biafran War, the Nigerian Civil War. So a lot of these countries, and Sudan recently just broke up into South Sudan, maybe 10 years ago, South Sudan and Sudan, because the South Sudanese people were constantly oppressed because they were put in this space where they're technically two different nations within one nation. So I would, that is not a pro at best. It's just a thing. But actually, the evidence shows it to be a pretty big con. And, it's also, and it's pretty interesting that Africans haven't tried to reconfigure this as much as possible, right? They've just sort of accepted the colonial borders, even though they struggle with them. So that's a conversation worth having as well with different African leaders going forward. What else? So the other thing is judicial and bureaucratic systems. Well, that they adopted this, we spoke about that, but for the most part, there are three main problems with this assertion. The first one is that these things, judicial and bureaucratic structures existed already in these spaces. They may not have been standardized across the continent, but of course, these societies, many of whom have been around for thousands of years, had nuanced legal systems. Why is this even a question? Secondly, the judicial systems put in place by the colonial governments were largely to facilitate the oppression of the Africans and/or to solve problems colonialism created. So nobody in their right mind can look at the legal system that was apartheid, for example, and applaud it for its contributions to law and order. Finally, judicial and bureaucratic systems grow out of and reflect a societal nature. Thus, when they are imposed from outside, it is often like fitting a square peg into a round hole. I'm of the belief that this was why many African countries continue to struggle with these systems decades after the end of colonialism. You have retained institutions that were not created for you, by you, or of you. It is so hard to imagine that people who inherited an exploitative colonial system meant to oppress all descent would also become heavy-handed, right? And I share this picture here, which might seem silly, but actually points to a very real, is emblematic of what I'm talking about, right? So these judges in Zimbabwe will spend thousands and thousands of dollars on buying wigs, and bear in mind that Zimbabwe is really struggling right now economically. But to look like these, to look like these British magistrates, if you will, it is so ridiculous. But again, that's more That may seem whimsical, but think about what it's connected with on the back end. People being arbitrarily arrested for dissent. We had recently Zimbabwean Lives Matter has been trending, and a lot of it stemmed out of the arbitrary arrest of different journalists who've been speaking up against government corruption and so forth. So, to the extent that these are positive things. And by the way, let me read a short quote here from Ibn Battuta on his visit to Mali back in the 14th century. He describes this: they possess admirable qualities. They are seldom unjust and have a greater abhorrence of injustice than any other people. Their Sultan, the Mansa, shows no mercy to anyone guilty of the least act of it. There is complete security in the country. Neither traveler nor inhabitant in it has anything to fear from robbers or men of violence. So when you talk about structures of justice and bureaucracy, it seems like many of these places, I mean, at least if this is anything to go by, we're doing all right. So I am wary of that as well. Then the advent of African nationalism, I didn't even have a clever picture to put on here because it's just so ridiculous. The idea that somehow colonialism is to be credited for the rise of movements that rose up against it is absurd. And the metaphor that I often give is that if I've been bullying you, right, and wait around the corner, grab your lunch money, smack you around, then you start working out and you get big and you take martial arts classes so you can take me down at some point, then you do. Or say, that phase just ends. I do not then get to claim that, I'm the reason he is big and agile and is proficient in Brazilian jiu-jitsu because I was the bully that made him do that. That is such roundabout thinking, right? Like, how can you take credit for putting people in an uncompromising position to react to you? So I don't think that that is not a pro. That is not a pro that is not one for the pro category of this balance sheet. People argue that the establishment of professional armies, but look at this. Ask yourself this: since the end of the colonial era, who have these armies been fighting? Right? Think about that. Sure, every now and then they'll rally to fight rogue forces such as Boko Haram in West Africa and Al Shabaab in East Africa, as well as things like the removal of Idi Amin with the help of the Tanzanians. The Zimbabwean army was very involved in the Zairean civil war. So every now and then something like that happens. But for the most part, they are the tools of governments to oppress their people. The vastly superior Nigerian army laid waste to Biafra, and disproportionately so. The recent Zimbabwean Lives Matter protests, which some of the violence is pictured here, have been in large part due to reaction to military abuses, and the South African Defense Forces, a relic of the apartheid era, has currently come under fire after the killing of a man found with a beard during COVID lockdown. And this story actually ended up inciting protests as well, much in the way that at the same time, that the George Floyd protests were happening in the US and around the world. So, to the people of South Africa, that idea of brutality, state brutality, those narratives were tied in together and it became a Pan-African sort of thing. Overwhelmingly, the militaries are a negative force, I'd argue. They're not, again, they're the henchmen of a mentor of mine, Dr. Sabelo Ndlovugacheni, recently shared this quote, and I don't remember where it was originally from. It's like, in the beginning, we were a state with an army. Now we are an army. Now we have an army with a state. So this is some of the things that are happening. What else? The spread of religion. Again, it's one of those like independent African states whereby it's only a pro in as much as somebody believes that their religion is the right one. You know, other than that, Africans had religions already, had different spiritual practices um, across the board. You know, so the idea that Africans do not have religion is pretty outlandish. They were not as standardized and imperial as say Christianity was, and Islam is also pretty big. But Islam predates, prominently predates colonialism. So that's a little bit different conversation. But in any case, you know, not only did Africans already have some religion, the only way this argument makes sense is if you believe that Africans are now going to heaven because Christianity came about. And that's a different debate outside of the scope of history. But if we're just talking about putting in place a religious system, they already had religious systems. And also, in many ways, Christianity itself was the handmaiden of colonialism and its brutalities. We can talk about. I spoke in an earlier video, and I'll put the link in the description as well, on how the Christian missionary Helm had mistranslated documents to King Lobengula, which led to him signing away the country to the British. Um, so because he had he had earned their trust. The Reverend had earned the trust of King Lobengula, and he betrayed it. So there's all these things, and even today there's so much that is going on with religion, with Christianity being used to siphon the resources of the masses, with people, desperate people, right, due to poverty, giving up their life savings and this thing. So it's not, the pros of it are very debatable, if you will. And I say this as well as a Christian myself. So I'm very well aware of. I try to be as objective as possible, and I see these things. So what are the cons? Well, the cons have been broken down as delayed political maturity, uneven infrastructure, arbitrary borders, downgrading of women's status, cultural erasure, and the psychological impact of colonialism. So let's look at those real quick. So when we talk about delayed political maturity, the idea is that societies evolve to maturity, just like people do. So for example, some of you may have seen this. If you've ever seen videos or stories of children who were kept, who were captive, who were maybe kept in the basement, or or children who grew up in the wild, for example, a lot of them face a long road to rehabilitation or resocialization, and a lot of them are very, almost rudimentary in their actions, right? So think about that. As that nations also evolve, you learn to walk, and you learn to speak, and you learn to socialize, you learn social cues. These are all things that are done with relative freedom, and when you are allowed to grow, so to speak. Think about a country like the US, right? This mighty nation, and the fact that it was 100+ years in before it even conceded women the right to vote, before Black people could vote. It was 100 years into the founding of it, or 90 years that the institution of slavery ended. And you look at these other civil rights gains here and there. And the reason I'm using that is it takes time as nations continue to mature, and even to this day, it's not perfect, as we very well know. But it takes time. You work through your kinks as a younger nation. Okay, yeah, this is not good. This is not progressive. This is not, and you work through it bit by bit, right? So when we talk about this delayed political maturity of colonialism, it's because these African countries were frozen in time, right? any idea of African nationalism or African rule was beaten down. Economic, their place in the economy, or at least even running the economy, was suppressed. Socio-political organizations were suppressed. So then at one point, it's again just being thrown into the mix when independence happened. And it doesn't help too that, for example, when Guinea became independent, the French people, the French destroyed a lot of the bureaucratic structures, like physically destroyed things. When Zimbabwe became independent, they inherited an incredible debt that they now had to foot from the British. So these countries are that century of colonialism really froze that development. And a lot of these countries, like Zimbabwe, is 40 years old now, but it's also 40 years on the back of 90 years of stunted development. Now, I make no excuses again for poor governance and corruption in these things, but I do think there's a level of political maturity that was denied the country because its parameters were founded on these structures, and yet it spent those years in captivity. And if you think about that metaphor I was using earlier with the children, then you can see why that might be detrimental, at least in the short term, and give us a much longer battle towards maturity, if you will. And even infrastructure. And I use this picture here from South Africa, to which the right side here is Soweto, then the other parts of Johannesburg. And what you will see immediately, even from an aerial point of view, is just stark, right? These houses on the left are clearly much bigger, much greener areas. You might even see some swimming pools here and there, right? As compared to this, which is the biggest slum in all of Africa. I believe this to be true, Soweto being the biggest slum in all of Africa. And so there are these huge disparities when you talk about the Europeans establishing this infrastructure. It wasn't done for the benefit of the people. No way. It was done traditionally, within apartheid South Africa. These are the areas where the white people would have lived, right? And the people coming from the right side would only be in these spaces to work as servants and things like that. So, and that's not just South Africa, right? Because some people say apartheid was peculiar. But look at this. At independence, there were 74 hospitals in Nigeria. Okay, not a bad number, but it's pretty small for a country of more than 40 million people. But look, 12 hospitals of those, sorry, not 74, 64 hospitals. 12 of those 64 hospitals, so like 1/5 of the hospitals, were for 4,000 white people who lived in South Africa. 12 hospitals for 4,000 white folks, strictly for white folks, 4,000. The other 52 hospitals were to be shared among the 40 million Africans. Do the math. It is incredible. 1/5, 12 hospitals for 4,000 people seems plenty. And those were probably the better hospitals anyway. But 52 hospitals for 40 million people. It is stark. It is stark. Here's another statistic from Zimbabwe, which again I know a lot about, and is become a pariah state right now. But this is in the immediate aftermath of its independence in the 1980s. And I quote from James Muzondiga's contribution to Becoming Zimbabwe, where he writes, with the help of local communities and foreign donors, especially from Scandinavian countries, yada yada, the government expanded the provision of health and educational facilities to areas previously ignored by the colonial state. It specifically built roads, schools, clinics, boreholes, and established sanitation facilities in community rural lands which lagged behind urban areas in terms of infrastructural development. In the education sector, for instance, enrollment in primary school rose from 82,000 in 1979, the last year of colonialism, to 2,216,078 by 1985. That's 6 years later. And in secondary schools, from 66,000 to 482,000 during the same period. Between 1980 and 1990, the number of primary schools and secondary schools had risen a remarkable 80%, from 3,358 to 6,042. Right? So, and there's several other statistics as well here talking about the provision of safe drinking water to 84% of the national population by 1988. A minimum wage was introduced, workers' bargaining strength was improved, all these things. Now, this is not to say Zimbabwe has remained perfect and, in fact, has fallen below the radar, but we can see that the improvements made in the immediate aftermath of independence highlight that, the idea of infrastructure having been created or being central to the project may be overstated, right? Finally, let me also say this, that because it was the infrastructural development was meant to serve the Europeans, a lot of it makes little sense in the post-colonial era. For example, a lot of the roads and railways were going out to the coast, and the idea that they were all going to the coast and don't necessarily connect the different African countries is because they were meant to, again, to siphon raw materials from the continent into the different countries, into the European countries, right? Back to Europe, back to the Western world, and so forth. So now Africa now has to undo a lot of these things so that it makes more sense for them as a post-colonial community. And maybe let me take it back a little bit, because I think there's a couple cons that I didn't, a couple of the pros that I didn't debunk. One of them was about raw materials, right? The idea of raw materials here. Okay. And the idea is, the primary sector, the growth of the primary sector. Well, the primary sector may be all good and dandy, but since the Industrial Revolution, we know that the real money lies in the secondary sector, i.e. manufacturing. So if anything, the growth of the primary sector may give a lot of people these rudimentary jobs, but what you want to invest in is an industrial revolution of sorts, some manufacturing and these things. So the primary sector, because what happens with the primary sector is resources are extracted, cobalt and copper and diamonds and gold and tobacco, and they go overseas and they are manufactured and sent back to Africa and sold to us at a profit. And that maintains a neo-colonial relationship and a dependent culture, if you will. So that has to be complicated, right? Because the growth of the primary sector was good because it worked well for the colonial empires, because they had it on both sides. They would use the African colonies to extract the resources, okay, take them to the home country, France, Britain, whatever, and manufacture them into things and sell them back to the Africans on the continent at 10 times, 100 times the price. So these are all things worth considering as well. I just thought I should get back to that. So where were we? We're talking about this. Arbitrary borders. I've already spoken about, with the Nigerian civil war and the way different communities are broken up. So I won't go over that again. One of the critical things was the downgrading of women's status. Remember, in pre-colonial Africa, we've seen that we had, and the image here is one of Queen Amina, but you have the likes of Queen Amina, Queen Nyamazana, Queen Awa of the Ashanti people. You're seeing Queen Zinga from Angola. So you have this sort of leaders. But during the colonial period, there were far fewer facilities for girls than for boys. Women could therefore not gain access into the professions, medicine, law, the civil service and even the bench. Very few women were even appointed to any European post, quote unquote, while there was never a female governor of a colony. So even the Europeans themselves were not giving women positions, white women or European women positions within the colonial government. The colonial world was definitely a man's world, and women were not allowed to play any meaningful role in it except as petty traders and farmers. That's the Europeans. And on the continent, with the issuing of passes and these sort of mining jobs coming in, those jobs were only there for the men. Okay, so the men became urbanites. As for example, say you're mining in Johannesburg, and they would, the women would be left in the reserves or the homelands or the rural areas or whatever they were called in that specific territory. Okay, so that gives the man all the economic power, right? All the economic power, where it hadn't been that way before. Back in the day, women could own land. Now the title deed owner could only be a man. Women in many different countries couldn't be in certain spaces without the permission of their husbands, right? They couldn't buy land without the written consent of their husbands, if they could buy it at all. So you see now the growth of this economic disparity between men and women. We see the destruction of the family and women being marginalized politically, and that is something that the continent is fighting tooth and nail to get over today. But you see there's a significant downgrading of women's roles by way of colonization. Then finally, cultural erasure. Part of the colonial project, right, as accompanied by Christianity in a prominent way, was to make everything African look inferior or be inferior, or and a large part of that was, a lot of people Europeans may just have believed that. But prior to the era of colonialism and enslavement, these communities just viewed each other as weird or strange. Oh, these people do this and do. It was never in such a way that it was dubbed inferior. The idea of African inferiority stems to support the imperialist project, at least in Eurocentric writing. That's what it grows out of. So you see, anything that was African, dubbed demonic, dubbed evil, dubbed primitive, primordial, even if it has direct parallels to something that happens in Europe or in Western societies. So, for example, African dances, African instruments. I remember being in church some years, a couple of decades ago back in Zimbabwe, and there was a raging debate about playing the mbira instrument, which if you don't know what that is, Google it. It's a pretty fascinating one. The mbira instrument can be played in church or not. It's like, this has been used in ancestral worship. And to me, even at 12, I understood how ridiculous that was, because, well, the guitar has been used in devil worship, and we play it in church. What does that mean? That doesn't define. But I don't want to get bogged down in all that. But the dances, the language, to the extent where the 1976 Soweto riots were an uprising against the imposition of Afrikaans, the language of apartheid, essentially, as the only language of instruction in Soweto, where the children grew up speaking a variety of indigenous African languages, Pedi and Zulu and the likes. So cultural erasure, prominently so. There's even in Zimbabwe right now, there's been conversation about erecting a statue of a anti-colonial fighter who was also a spirit medium. Her name is Nehanda Charwe, who led the first resistance against colonialism in the 1890s. And the debates around that, some of them make sense. Should this be the thing we do right now? And especially as the country is suffering economically. But some people, the loudest voices are around it being, idol worshipping, right? Idol worshiping, and her being a demonic presence in the country, a country that has multitudes of Virgin Mary statues all over the place, a country that will fight to protect the grave of Cecil John Rhodes in the colonizer who still lies in Metropos to this day. So it's ridiculous. That's that cultural erasure, right? That we as scholars are fighting against right now, trying to talk more about our culture. And also tied to that is the psychological impact, where even many people in African communities are still struggling to get over the psychological impact of being made to feel inferior and so forth as a result of the colonial process. So I tell my students this as an example. Something that bothers me a lot is this idea of in Shona, which is my native language out of Zimbabwe, the word for a white person, one of the words for a white person is murungu, right? Murungu. But that is also the term that is used to describe a sponsor or somebody with the means, So if we were to go out to the club tonight and I'm buying all the drinks, somebody might very well say, Murungu is here, Murungu Ashika. Meaning the boss is here, but it actually means the white guy is here. Now think about Zimbabwe now. A lot of the people there have grown up, the majority of the people have grown up without regularly encountering white people in their circles, right? At least not, there are white people there that people interact with, but I'm saying the majority, just based on the size of the population and the schisms of where people live, the majority of the people do not have a lot of white people that they interact with on the regular. So for a 20-year-old, 25-year-old to be saying that, they're saying Murungu wangu without any context of a white person who's done all these things for them. So that I'm saying this to say, like, the collective memory is so ingrained that it exists to this day. And I don't mean this to bash the Zimbabwean community, but I'm saying it's little things like that. We were having a debate in another space where we were talking about using Shona. Again, I keep referencing this because those are the spaces that I'm in, to write your dissertation or something like that. And so many folks were arguing there vehemently, like that would be impossible because Shona is not a progressive language. How would you talk about concepts like this and that in Shona? Like, first of all, the Bible came to Zimbabwe and we were able to translate all that into Shona, right? Concepts we'd never heard before. We spoke about crucifixion. We talked about angels. We talked about cherubims. We talked about Julius Caesar and all these concepts, right? It only becomes a not progressive just when we talk about that could actually uplift the community by and large. So these are the arguments that we have. And by the way, people are starting to write their dissertation in indigenous African ways, but not in Shona yet, but I've seen some in Xhosa in recent years. So these are things that, as an aside. So this is what we're up against: the psychological impact of feeling that things of African origin and things of Africa are inferior, inherently inferior to those that are European. That is something that the continent continues to struggle with today. So that's the balance sheet of colonialism. Oh, by the way, let me make this very important assertion right now to the pros, right? Even the pros, even if you can justify the pros, the development of infrastructure, the exchange of ideas and these things, right? They did not have to happen that way. They did not have to happen that way. Imagine if if a woman is sexually assaulted and she has a child as a result of that assault. And I hate to get graphic, but colonialism and its violence was also very graphic. And she has a child as a result of that assault. probably knowing how mothers are, she'll grow up to love that child. And the child will probably be a blessing to her life, right, in the long term. However, you can never turn around and say, like, oh, thank God you got sexually assaulted. You wouldn't have this kid. Because there are other ways of having kids. She could have had that kid. She could have had that child in a consenting way, and these things. So I use that rather crude analogy to say this. Ideas have been exchanging since time immemorial, right? To this day, they are exchanging. Groups trade with each other. Think about all the countries that were not involved, European countries that were not involved in the colonial project, that are well advanced. Think about countries like Japan, or some of these countries that are modernizing at this pace, some of them that were never colonized. I say that to say there are other ways in which these ideas can exchange. We can trade. People can visit each other and bring consultants and things like that. So to say those things are pros of colonialism is to justify that violence, which it did not have to be. The only way roads and railroads and things were not only that was not the only way they could have been built in Africa, right? No way. So when we talk about this idea of those being pros of colonialism, it's masking things that could have happened in other ways. Colonialism is not the only 19th and 20th century interaction of civilizations that could have existed. So I'll end with that, and think about that, and what are our key takeaways from today? Well, what are some purported pros of colonialism? How do they hold up? Be able to argue that. What are the cons? Think about that as well. And what other points on either side do you reckon can be made? Did I miss something out? Did I romanticize or was too critical about this or that? Let me know in the comments what you come up with, and please do like, share, and subscribe to this channel. I will stop sharing the video now. I'll stop. Indeed. So absolutely, that's our video for today. It's been one that I've been meaning to make for a while, and I hope you enjoy it. And I will take some time to develop new material going forward.